Welcome back to DAGryffyn Hobby. My name's Dave. Today I went to the Northeast Large-Scale Train Show in West Springfield, Massachusetts. The show is predominantly G-scale, but there was also O-gauge, some S, pre-war trains, probably some standard gauge, and I did even find an N-scale train there. Sure, it was on one of the layouts, but hey, this is a large-scale train show, and I found an N-scale train. If you've been up to the Big E for the other train show that Amherst Railway Society puts on, the one that takes place in multiple buildings, this one takes place just in the Better Living Center, and it's that weird-shaped building that you can't possibly keep track of where you've been because it's such an odd shape. But there was plenty of room for layouts, and it was really a pretty cool show. From what I understand, the show has only been going on for about 3 years, and I have to say the attendance seemed pretty low. I myself just heard about the show recently, probably when I was up in West Springfield earlier in the year. I've been to a lot of train shows, and of course they're mostly O-gauge based, but I have not seen this much G-scale stuff in one place ever. And there were some really, really good deals. I spent a couple hours, walked around the building, took as many pictures as I could, and I really tried to get contact information and business cards for all the vendors. So if you see something you like, hopefully you can contact the person selling it. One of the things I was looking at was a dairy car, but unfortunately it was part of a set. And I wasn't interested in spending a lot of money, especially since York was just last weekend, where I came home with this nice little mogul right here. The gentleman that sold me that mogul, Sean, was at this show also, and I happened to find this in his booth. He also had that dairy car that I saw that I wanted but was part of a set, but that's okay. There was another dairy car. Now this one is very much like one of the ones I already have, but I really have no problem with duplicates. And it's a Dairy Experts Hood milk car. These are my new addiction. They're just dusty. This one's dusty. They're really neat cars. The high-speed trucks are very cool. The doors open and close. There's just nice details, great graphics, and they're just kind of really neat to run a bunch of them together. So behind me I have my mogul, a couple of refrigerator cars, and my 3 milk cars. We'll add this one on and take a look. The nice thing about these cars is that apparently they're individually numbered. This one's 505 and the one I have is 503. So even though I have two of them, they're not exact, so that's fantastic. I've really been enjoying running these dairy cars, I guess because they're just different than any of the other types of cars that I have. So, you know, a little variety is pretty exciting. I am going to try to not get duplicates, but I wanted one, or a second one, and I had to support my buddy Sean and get something from his booth. There are definitely other dairy cars that I've seen that I really like, so I'll have to keep an eye out for some of those. After I walked around and took pictures of all the vendors, well, I went outside and took a break, but then I came back in and tried to get some decent footage of the layouts. And the great thing about G-scale layouts is that, I mean, obviously the trains are big. It's certainly a lot easier to film G-scale than it is to film N-scale. You know, you really have to get close with N-scale. But with the G, you can even step back and kind of get a swooping or, you know, panning shot and take in more of the layout because the trains are so big. I did not stay all day. I was honestly tired and wanted to come home. So I stayed until maybe 1:30 and then I had to head home. I really enjoyed seeing all the G-scale stuff, and I know there are people out there that love the G-scale. So if you're into G-scale and you're anywhere near Massachusetts, next year when they have the show, make sure you stop in. But it was a good show, and I'm just hoping that I don't start needing G-scale stuff now.
Oh, maybe that's what it was. An excursion.
I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time on DAGryffyn Hobby.